All right, ladies and gentlemen. So today we're gonna be doing an alteration on these white shirts. What's happening here is we're just gonna take in the sides a little bit. The arms are actually fine, but we are gonna redo this entire hem. As you see, it's a fell seam, and I don't like going from a fell seam to a regular seam just willy-nilly. So I'd rather just redo the entire seam. Now this gent, we are gonna shorten the cuff. We're gonna shorten by 5.5. So you see that gets us right here to the button. So there's no chance we're just going to do that. We're going to unpick this whole placket and move it up, which also makes it great that we're opening all of this because then it's going to be nice and flat. And redoing the placket will be lacquer or more simple. For now, doing the unpicking, I'm not going to unpick the cuff. I just want to show you something while we are there. But the first thing, obviously, you will not be surprised to know that um, a chain stitch, in this case it's a chain stitch on a fell seam, is going to come undone very easily. So I'm just going to unpick a little bit of this hem and leave a little bit closer on there. Just unpick a bit of that hem just so I can get in there to the chain stitch, and then you know how it goes. You're just going to try and wiggle out a little section, and the chain stitch will always go in one direction. So if we, I think we should actually go the other direction. No, let's try this direction. So the one thing about the fell seam is that one edge of the seam allowance is going to be longer than the other one. And if we're going from that to a regular seam, we're going to have to just compensate for that. And so I like to have a little portion here by the cuff, just to kind of double check myself, double check my maths, which we'll do in a minute as soon as this chain stitch decides to chain itself. You know, sometimes it just takes a bit of faith and a bit of patience and a bit of emotional support. Maybe it is from the other side. Let's see. Yeah, just don't give up. Just be strong. What is going on here? It's the weirdest chain stitch I ever saw. There we go. And there you go. You're going to undo that whole thing. So we're going to carry on with these, with unpicking, and then we'll be back to discuss this fell seam. Just a quick tip about these chain stitches. I found it with shirts. I can't think of another example at the moment, but I find it very common. Let's unpick this one. It's going from bottom to top, from the hem to the cuff, and they're both going in the same direction. Side note, we're obviously going to just put this tag aside. Why am I going to leave it there for now? I'm going to leave it there for now, then I don't lose it or forget about it. But if it wasn't stitched there, I'd be putting it aside. Back to our chant. If this one's going from the hem to the cuff, 9 times out of 10, the other side is going to go in the opposite direction. It's going to go from the cuff to the hem. So here I'll start fighting at the cuff, and then if that doesn't work, I'll go to the hem, but I'll prepare myself emotionally for it to be unpicking from the cuff. Except now, of course, for the camera, it decides, Willies, have I not suffered enough? Very strange. Okay, fine. Let's try the hem. That's what you want. Sometimes it's like a USB. You have to put it in 3 different ways in order to find which is the right direction. Oh, look at that. Okay, well, there's the 1 time out of 9 where it's actually going the other direction. The other shirt I did was like that. One was going top to bottom, the other one bottom to top. But anyway, that's how it goes. Let me undo this one. So while you are doing this unpicking, you can just put a little, just let me unpick this and focus myself, not try and do 100 things at once. There we go. So I'm just going to put a pin over here, just to keep that together. And of course, at the cuff, this is also being kept together, so we could do it there, but I just want to do it here. Obviously, on this side, we're not going to leave all of these lost peels just lying around. We're going to make sure that this one is actually completely out. That's because the inside braid. There it is. So we're going to make sure that all of that is also undone and not getting in between our stitches. So, I just put that pin there to kind of secure it in place. I'm just going to put one right here on the edge. So this basically is where the two pieces are joining, the front and the back. And we're going to unravel and see what is the mystery. There you go. So this is quite a regular fell seam where you see one portion is maybe 3/4, and the other one, if we go from the join all the way out, okay, this one is like 2.5 maybe, which this is actually just a poorly done one. Thank you for that, Woolies. You see, usually where this portion is actually, this is excess for them. It should have actually ended there, so that where that fold is should have been cut, so that folds in and then over. I think, am I on drugs? That should have been the cut. That should have been the cut. Yeah, so that folds. Of course, yeah. Let's go back to this portion here and just see. Yeah, that should have been the cut. Yes, because that's going to fold in and then over. Yes, that's correct. So this little portion they've got here is actually excess. The machinist was not paying too close of attention. So be aware of this, and be aware especially that it can vary quite a bit. Let's see here. So I mean, all of this we're seeing more or less the same. And again, this is why we've kept the cuff like that. Okay, so this is, you see here, there's very little extra there, maybe like 1/4 centimeter. But then here, here we've got a whole 1/2 centimeter, there back to 1/4. Down here we've got a whole centimeter. So, when we do these alterations, it's going to be how can I say, a bit of a gamble to get the exact numbers, but we can handle it. We're profesh. So let's do the maths. Let's say we've got, call it 1 centimeter on the one side, 2 centimeters on the other side. So in total, our joint seam allowance 3 centimeters. So if we just divide that equally amongst the two portions, we make our seam allowance 1.5 both sides. That should actually sort us out. So let's just see if that is the case. So how I do, this is why I leave the cuff like that. We're just going to pretend to stitch there with a pin. And then I'm just going to see on the cuff, is that going to come back together nicely? Obviously, if we're not redoing the cuff, then that is exactly how I want it to return. That's going to be perfect. In this case, like I said, we are redoing the cuff, but I'm at this stage not unpicking it. So we can just double check our maths there. So basically, even though this was a fell seam, I'm now going to turn it into a regular seam and do a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. The little bit of variation between, like you can see that portion there, that's how it actually should be cut off like that. There's a little bit of variation between what you see there and what you see, let's find a hectic portion. What you see up here, that little bit of variation, we're just gonna kind of ignore and pretend it's not really happening. Also, because you split that between the two seams, it's going to be like 1/4 centimeter each. So no one will die. we can see this one probably going to be roughly the same. You see here, this is how false seam is supposed to look. Here's our cut edge. But you see sometimes the machine will fold that portion over. If it's like quarter centimeter, not a problem, but you can see in some portions it's coming all the way to a centimeter, which is neither here nor there. At the end of the day, we are just going to make the fashion. So I'm going to continue unpicking the cuffs, and then we'll take it from there. Right, so I'm almost done with the unpicking. I wanted to unpick this last one together. One thing I want to look at is, as you can see, our seam allowance here. I hope you can see that. Our seam allowance is not very consistent. So I need to be very aware of that as I'm doing my alterations. Here we're about 1 centimeter, here maybe down to 3/4 of a centimeter. So when I move my cuffs, I just need to be aware of this, making sure that I'm kind of compensating for the skewness. And also I'm going to give everything an iron to make sure that our work comes out straight. Then the other thing that I thought was interesting is, this shirt, even though they're same company, same size, same everything, the one placket was done like that. So, and you'll see this one is a completely different story, which is quite an interesting one. This is why I actually really love the alteration service, because it's always helping me to learn new ways of doing things. There's hundreds of different ways, and every time we do an alteration, we're going to learn a little bit new. So this placket, you'll see once I get it open, is done in one long strip and then kind of fold it around. So let's just unpick that and see what it looks like. The other thing I can maybe say at this time is that you see the cuffs. They're also made in this portion where you just put your sleeve in there and close it one time. Not a fan of that method because of what we just saw with the seam allowance. It's very difficult to keep the seam allowance consistent if you're using that method. So I like to do it in 2 steps. This is open here, and then we first sew on this inside piece, and then we fold it in, sew on the outside. But obviously in the factories they are very, very time conscious. So they're doing a bit of a fast one, which you can't blame them. But of course, as you see, the result is that seam allowance being a bit of anyone's guess. So you see how it's done there. They cut. Let's look at this one. They cut it in the same way as this one is cut. But then instead of putting a separate under placket and over placket, they just do it in one like that, in this long strip, and then fold it up. So if it's something that I haven't seen before or that I think is maybe going to challenge me, then what I like to do is just take photos as I go, because where we can, we want to redo the work as similar to the original as possible. So if it's something that I just haven't seen, then as I'm unpicking, I'll just be taking photographs so that I can kind of reverse those steps and redo it more or less as the original. Here I'm just going to grab this button off and make sure I put it in a packet that is going to stay with the shirts. So yeah, that's about that. Once I've done all this unpicking, the first thing I'm going to do is hit the iron and just give all these seams a press so that everything comes out nice and neat and straight. And then from there, we can look at how we're going to do the alteration on the side body and then also shortening these cuffs. So catch you in a moment. All right, back from the iron. You can see everything is nice and flat, and I've also taken out all of my unpicking threads. I don't want those to just hang around and get into the stitching as we continue. So first thing I'm going to do is check, is this cuff straight? And I mean, this, as you see, it's not 1000% straight, but that's really because the fabric likes to warp as you're working with it. But it is more or less straight. It doesn't have that extra centimeter curve here by the placket, or the extra centimeter curve this way at the seam allowances. So this one we're going to treat as straight. So this gent, we're going to minus the cuff by 5.5. That's from the original cuff, which is more or less here, to where the new cuff's going to be 5.5 centimeters. So you can see these guys, as we discussed here, let me just draw the seam allowance that they did. You can see their seam allowance is really a bit of a gamble. So I'm just going to work on a 1 centimeter seam allowance. That is more or less what they were trying to do. And if you look at the other shirts, that's also what it is. So I'm just going with that. I want to get to 5.5, but I want my seam allowance to be 2. It's going to reduce waste, number one, and it's also going to allow us to adjust this again if it ends up being too short. We can lengthen it by about 1.5 centimeters. Okay, so at the end of the day, if I cut this 5.5, from the original cut line 5.5, and then do a 1 centimeter seam allowance, that's going to mean from the original to the new is 5.5, and I want an extra centimeter because I don't want that 1 centimeter seam allowance. I want 2 centimeters. So instead of cutting 5.5, I'm going to do one less and cut 4.5. We're going to cut 4.5. And then our seam allowance is going to be 2, which is going to be a bit of a drama to squeeze into the cuff in the way that it's done, but we're going to cope. And you'll see here, this is now the original cuff. Let's see. You can always check yourself. The original cuff, it's like that. Now, from the original to the new, here's my new stitch line. This is like 5.25 because I'm not goofing around with such a inconsistent seam allowance. 5.25, 5.5. Now it's going to die, and there's going to be my new cuff. And you can even, if you really want to be extra, do something like this. Let's see. There's my original cuff. Okay, now there's going to be my new cuff, and look at that. Oh, gosh, 5.5 centimeters have reduced. So however you want to math the maths, it's up to you. At the end of the day, what I'm going to do is cut 4.5 centimeters here. Then here, I'm also going to do this, especially now that the sleeve is open. I'm going to first finish the placket and then work on the side seam. I'm going to do the side seam and the sleeve one time. So here I can use the original measurement. See, it's 15, and they stopped at about 14 and then did that miter corner in. So I can just do that myself, and I'm going to more or less stay as straight as I can with this original. What did we say? 15, hey? Yeah, 15. Now, of course, they're doing 15, their seam allowance is 1 centimeter. So they're doing 15 from here. So actually, our placket is going to be a little bit shorter, but that's not going to be such a problem. I'll rather have it flush with the edge, a little bit shorter here, because again, if this ends up being too short, heaven forbid, then we can at least have these 2 centimeters that we can adjust it here. Whereas if the plaquet's not too short, then we don't have that much to adjust. So that whole exercise would be pointless. So I'm going to measure that 15. I'm just going to mark for myself 1 centimeter down, just to remind myself that that's where I'm going to do my miter. So I'm going to do that on all the cuffs, and then we will progress to plaquettes. How exciting. All right, so let's get to doing our plaquettes. Originally this was actually stitched, first stitched there, and then that's flipped under. I'm just going to skip a little bit of that. I'm going to look for the top side of this must be a little bit less than the bottom. You can see the bottom is sticking out by like 1 mil or so. So this is going to be the top side, and of course I want the small placket to be on the small part of the sleeve, or the under part, or the back part, however you want to call it. And I'm just going to squeeze this in there. This is kind of the same method as the cuff, and I also don't like it. It's just tough to keep a very consistent straight line. But this is just how it's done, so that's how we're going to do it. And as you know, I am an insatiable pinner, so we're just going to pin that all the way up. Here, this original cut, the original miter there, we want to make sure that we really tuck that in because we don't want that flapping about. And then here at the top of the miter, I am just going to make sure it kind of just bites that part of the miter. I'm not going to stitch further than that. So I'm just going to make sure I don't have any frayed edges out there. I'm just going to make sure I cut that. And I'm just going to iron it up and then stitch it with a top stitch. But, we'll see it as we go. So I'm going to be stitching that. Let's take a look at our other method. Where is that sleeve? Here it is. So I'm working on the top of the sleeve or the right side of the sleeve. And I completely forgot to even mark this or cut it or anything like a crazy person. So these ones were actually 16 centimeters. So you see you've got 15 there, but I've got one here, so 16. And again, this miter shape. These are 16 because it has to go all the way to the top of the placket, whereas the other one, the placket extends a little bit above the cut itself, which I actually quite like that. And we are on the top. No, that's the bottom. We are on the top, and we're going to take the strip, see which side is the top. I think it's this side is the top. This one's a bit of a gamble. But the most important thing is that the button portion is going to be on the small side and the buttonhole is going to be on the big side. So I'm just going to stitch it from there. Ooh, sorry about that. We're going to stitch it from there. I'm obviously going to do thousands of pins. And again here, I'm just leaving it just a little bit over the edge there. I like to do that because it allows me to straighten it up afterwards without causing me too much drama. So I always leave that little bit of excess. And kind of following the original stitch lines, but not really. As long as I've got around 1 centimeter. This portion, of course, is a little bit tougher. I want to make sure that original cut is definitely tucked in there. You can, if you're really extra, put some fusing and some stitching there. But I think that's a little bit too much, so we're just going to stitch straight over that. This is a bit of a tricky portion, but really you're putting this as straight as you can and just making sure you catch the seam allowance, or you catch the shirt kind of above those cuts a little bit. It's probably a bit much what I've done there, but I really don't like this method because of this whole situation where you have to stitch so close to those cuts. And I just find this method of the placket rather bulky, but it is a lot faster. Obviously, you'll see now, when we continue with the plackets, this one finishes way earlier. Okay, so of course, after we sew, we immediately go to the iron. I've already been there. You see, this one, you just have to kind of manipulate it, fold it exactly how you want it till you get it to the shape that you want. There is my placket. And I'm just going to stitch that. I'm going to stitch it along the original line. So I'm just going to see the original stitch lines and just replicate that. Easy peasy. What I dislike about this is that it gets very bulky here, which I don't like. I like things to be nice, smooth, and soft. But anyways, that's a topic for another day. This one, like I was saying, is just going to take a little bit longer, especially if, like a bread, you iron this the wrong way around, like myself. So this little corner that we had there, a little triangle, should actually be ironed to the top. I cannot tell you how often I make this mistake. Basically, every single time I do a placket. But anyway, that's why we always got to be checking ourselves. Just going to give that a little bit of iron with my hand. Okay, so then we're going to take the upper placket and we're going to do the same story. We're just going to squeeze it in there, leaving a little bit on the edge of the cuff. And we are just going to pin the living daylights out of it. Yeah, so nothing too exciting here. I think the only really exciting thing is here, that little triangle that we skipped. It should fold up towards the right side. And like I said, the original guys, they sewed that closed there. I really don't see the point. So I'm just going to skip that. Yeah, we're just going to keep squeezing that in. And, this one was prepared with this fold under here to really squeeze right there by that cut of the mitre. Some people call these shields. I've heard this called the shield of a cuff. I don't know. I always thought it was called the placket, the cuff placket. But, it's a wide world out there. I don't really think there's 100% right name. But the 100% right thing to do, you see this little edge here. As we're sewing, we're not just going to leave that edge sticking out there just to harm our eyes. As we're stitching, you're just going to tuck that kind of thing in, so that everything is going to end up neat. And here again, I'm going to just go with the original stitch lines. I don't know if you can see that on the camera. And what they did, where's my pen? So usually you'll start somewhere here, back tack, you'll go around and then around like that one time. They, for funsies, started here, went around and came back around and then went all the way down. It's a free country. Do what you like. Just make it fashion. So I'm going to be stitching that and we'll go from there. All right, so stitching is done. As you can see here, just stitch around that shape. There's our placket. Of course, I am going to put the buttons back on. See here, it's a little bit extra. So here what I like to do is just put a little pin and then straighten this up so that my plaquettes are 1000% straight. So I know when I put my cuff, even here you can see there's a little bit of a mismatch there. But I know if I put my cuff correct at 1 centimeter seam allowance, then this is going to line up because I've matched my plaquettes there. While I'm here, I'm just going to, or actually 2 centimeter seam allowance, I'm just going to draw my seam allowance. It's just easier to do now while this thing is nice and flat. You can do it later, but I'm just going to do it now just because I remember to do it now, so I'm going to do it now. And it's easier when everything is flat. Just a quick comment on this placket, the other one. So what I did was I did that little round stitch. I don't think you can really see on the camera, but what happened is that I just started in the wrong spot and I was going around and then I realized, I'm actually going to come and close the side of the placket. But I did not panic. I just went double over that section and then came down this side. So if you do find yourself having started on the wrong section of the placket or the wrong point and you got twisted around or whatever and you all of a sudden closing your placket, don't stress too much. Just go over the little top stitch section there, go down the correct side. So I am also here going to just mark my seam allowance quickly. Yeah, of course I am. And obviously I'm going to just cut the placket 100% straight here. So now that the plaquettes are done, we can proceed to the side seam alteration. Okay, I think I'll just go straight to that so that we can carry on, and the other seam allowances on the other cuffs we'll do on the round, which is going to be a little bit more challenging, but now it's going to be done. So over here, as you know, pinning is my life. So I'm going to match my underarm seams. Now, with a fell, things can go a little bit awry. So I'm going to match the underarm, match the hem, and match the cuff. And then on the flat, I'm just going to see what is going on exactly. So I'm just going to kind of lay that out, see what's happening there. This actually looks all right. You know, fabric, it likes to move. See, we can see a little bit of an excess bubble there, but I actually don't think it's really such a drama. Next look here. See, that looks to match reasonably well. So yeah, you know, I wouldn't then mismatch my underarm. If I see that there's, you know, excess here and excess here that, you know, if I shift the underarm, it will actually make sense, then I'll do that. But in this case, it doesn't, so I won't. You know, this amount of excess here, I'm actually just going to kind of ease in, especially if it's on the back sleeve, because that gives you a bit of space for the elbow to move. So I'm not going to trim that down. Okay, so now the sleeve, in this case, we're not adjusting at all. So here we're just going to go with a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance all the way up until the underarm, 1.5. Now, me, I like to, you know, I like to stitch from top to bottom. So from the sleeve down. So I'm just orientating this so that that will be the direction of my stitching. And then, you know, when I do the other side, I'll just flip it so that I can again stitch from the cuff down to the hem. I like doing it like that. It prevents twisting and also just keeps, you know, keeps me focused. Make sure that I'm not accidentally stitching, you know, one thing in some funny way. Just keeps me always, I don't know, that's just how I like it. So now here, okay, we're going to be at 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. So my alterations are 4 down, and this 4 is measured on a fell seam, is measured from the center of the seam, not from, you know, up or down, just from the center. Of course, that 2 moles is not going to kill anyone, so we don't have to stress. But that is where it's measured from. So our seam allowance is 1.5, okay, and that is our 0. So this is where we begin. 10 down is 1.5. So here I'm just going along with my notes. So my seam allowance is 1.5. And I want to reduce with 1.5. 15 down, we're keeping it like that. So seam allowance is 1.5. I want to reduce with 1.5. So obviously my mark is at 3. And then here on the hem, seam allowance is 1.5. I want to reduce with 1. So of course that's 2.5. Here on the hem, you know, you don't want a shape like this, causing this little corner on the hem. So we're going to make sure that's nice and straight. Curve that in here to the waist. And then smooth this out. So, you know, here I can already see this is going to be a bit of a problem. So I'm going to take that in a little bit more than I actually intended with my marks. And here I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'm not going to get all the way to the 1.5. I'm going to cheat that just so that this line is nice and smooth. You know, I don't want a corner anywhere. And the sleeve is 1.5. I'm not going to mark that. I'm just going to use the lines on my machine. So, you know, I'm just going to stitch that up. This I'm going to leave here for now. Once I've done all of this and we're doing the overlocking, I'll shift that up and I'll catch you with the overlocker. But otherwise, easy peasy. See you. One little trick I like to do, it works very well if I'm doing trousers, especially like a taper on a trouser. Instead of now each and every single side of the shirt, we're now going to measure again the same measurements and do the same. I mean, I can just take that side, lay the side next door, then I can see where were my reference points. And by this time, I've actually done it a couple of times. So I can just memorize them. I know that's 1.5. This one is 3. This one is 3. That one is 1. No, that one is 2.5. So it's 1 plus 1.5. And I know that, you know, I'm skipping that one, cheating that one, cheating that one. Here I want to 3. So yeah, it just makes it easier to you know, get your markings done a lot quicker, and also it makes sure that the stitching is all happening in the same direction. So especially for a taper of a trouser, this makes it a lot faster. You don't have to measure, you know, all 4 sides of the pants. You can just measure one, and then each one you can just compare to that and quickly draw it in from there. So I'm going to go sew this, and then we'll go from there. Okay, back from stitching my side seams. And if you look closely on this one, you'll see what I do. I stitch, one stitch at 1.5 and then the alterations there. And then I go right next door and I stitch another stitch. Just under the arm, not very far, just maybe 10 centimeters each side of the armhole. Just because it gives it a little bit of strength there, because that is the part where there's a lot of tension. You don't really need to. That's just one thing that I like to do. And then my maximum seam allowance is 2 centimeters. So obviously on the sleeve, I don't need to do any alterations there or any trimming there because that seam allowance is 1.5. 2 centimeter seam allowance, it is extreme, but it does allow us to alter in the future if this guy, heaven forbid, were to gain weight or donate this to someone else, whatever it is. More seam allowance, more options. But more than 2 centimeters, I find gets just a little bit bulky and in the way. So 2 centimeters is my max. Under the arm, I won't have more than 1.5. They are always trimmed down to 1.5 because here it's going to become too bulky and too difficult to turn that corner if it's 2 centimeters. So there I trim it down, and you see this also, it's going to reduce waste by not trimming down further. So it prolongs the life of the garment by enabling future alterations, reduces waste, and makes me happy. So that's what we do. This I'm just putting here immediately. We're going to catch this in the overlocking, which is what I'm going to do right at this moment. Okay, I'm just back from the overlocking, and all I did was just iron that seam towards the back. Kind of standard in the industry, I ironed up my hem one time so that I can just stitch this one time while I'm at the sewing machine anyway. So here I'm just going to go and attach my cuff, easy peasy. You can see here I've got my marks where my 2 centimeter seam allowance is. And you will see here, because of the shape of the sleeve, this creates a bit of a corner here. So you'll see when I join the sleeve, I feel nothing to cheat here a little bit, just to make that a little bit easier to do, especially with such a large seam allowance. So all I'm really going to do is make sure that I'm matching my buttonhole to buttonhole. I don't want to put my cuff on the wrong way around. I mean, I'd like to say you only made that mistake once, but truth is I've made it 1,000 times. So it's just life. And see, I really want to get right there in the corner. I don't want a little step between my placket and my cuff. This is now tough with the 2 centimeter seam allowance because there's a top stitch right up to there. So I only actually have about maybe 3/4 centimeter of free space in there, and now I'm trying to jam in 2 centimeters. But I'm really just strong and I can handle that. And like I say, it reduces waste and it also prolongs the life of this garment by enabling us to do more alterations in the future. So there, on the top side of the placket, the front side of the cuff, I've just pinned a little bit past the placket. Here on the back, making sure we've got a nice flush edge. Again, this is why I dislike this method. It's hard to get it really nice and flush. And also, it is really hard to get this seam allowance 100% straight. You can think for yourself whether people do these marks in the factory and do the pins and all of that. Obviously not. We saw what the seam allowance was like. So, but even for us, we really rather do the two-step method where you first attaching the underside of the cuff, and that just helps the seam allowance to be more consistent, easier without all of this extra anguish. Here I'm actually a bit of a ghetto person who is calling me now. Yeah, I was just saying I kind of let the shirt forward once to fall. Obviously, this has been, pre-done, so it already had a bit of a crease there. But I don't really measure this out. I just let the sleeve kind of fall where it wants to fall, as long as this fold is not too intense. I don't really think it's such a drama to get that exact on different on the different cuffs. But that is that, ladies and gentlemen. I'm just gonna stitch that, stitch the hem, and then we'll be replacing the buttons. And that is that. That's the shirt alteration, sides and shortening the cuffs. Easy peasy.